Hi, everyone. Thanks for we're lightening the mood. We're going to talk about data. So we're going to, this is going to be the most fun panel of the day, lead you into lunch. So we're going to, do we need a napkin?
Nope.
No.
It's just water.
Okay.
Sorry.
So we're going to talk a little bit about building a consumer data capability today, the good, bad, and the ugly. And I'm joined by Michael Lampert here, the Global Director of Marketing Data Strategy and Consumer Engagement Lead from Mondelēz. So there's a lot of words in that title, so he's got a lot going on, and he's going to have a lot to talk to us about today, about kind of what he's been working on his end. So kind of as we dive into this, I'd love to hear a bit about where you started and how you wound up at Mondelēz and what you've been doing there.
First of all, I wanted to just say thank you to Brand Innovators and, all the sponsors and Teads and Sydney Kaplan and all the people from Brand Innovators that put this together. And thanks everybody for coming and to Group M for hosting. I used to work at Group M, so this is sort of a homecoming. But yeah, I'm Michael Lampert. I work at Mondelēz, otherwise known as the company that makes Oreo cookies. Most people don't know what Mondelēz is, and that's by design. So I am the global marketing data lead. So it's a fancy way of saying I'm trying to help us understand how we use technology to acquire and activate and build an entire data ecosystem inside of Mondelēz that the brands, the tech partners, and our consumers obviously can benefit from. I've been there for about 3 years. I spent 25 years at every agency in the world, including this building. Recently went over to the client side about 3 years ago. Someone can ask me how different it is because it's extremely different. But yeah, this is a really complex topic. A lot of people want to hear about what we've been doing. We started this like 3 years ago. We think we're doing a pretty good job. It's just a very expensive and very long journey to do all this. So
yes, and I have a lot of questions for you about that because it's a huge challenge kind of in general, but specifically with CPG brands, we've seen that they're traditionally very challenged around collecting that first party data. But Mondelēz has made a concerted effort to move away from third party data and dive headfirst into first party data. So talk to us about how you approach that first party data collection and kind of how this all started with Mondelēz and kind of how it's been successful for you.
Well, I'm the beneficiary of something that started about 3 years before I started. So we actually, our leadership decided that we wanted to do all the behind the scenes, expensive, non-sexy work to get away from third-party cookies about 3 years ago. So I would say we almost have no reliance globally on third-party cookies unless it's mandatory. And about 60 to 70% of all global impressions have some what we would call known capability inside of them. So our data usually comes from three main places, which is what we call zero-party data, which is basically fully PII compliant data. First-party data, which we consider data that comes in through engagement at sites or apps, and second-party data, which is what we consider our retail partner data. Probably about 30% is zero-party data, probably 50% is first-party data, and about 20% would be our retail partners data that we're just getting into.
Great. So let's kind of pick those apart a little bit. When we're talking about the zero-party data, kind of how are you? I think that's the hardest piece for a lot of these CPG brands. I think Mondelēz has a lot of really strong brands in Oreo and Sour Patch Kids and things like that. So it would be really helpful, I think, to understand how you've built that capability for some of your more popular brands where people are kind of willing to give that information. And also for some of the brands that are less likely to gather so that there could be learnings around, other CPG products, maybe diapers, things like that.
Well, the front end for us is the website. So we're fortunate. We're not, a diaper company or an airline company or a credit card company. When I had interviewed for the job, the CMO said to me, Michael, we can put out a tweet for Oreo and get 1 million people to engage with it. So what? What are you going to do with it then? So what we found is that acquiring data isn't difficult. It comes in through the site, it comes in through D2C, it comes in through e-commerce, the retailers. The hardest part we've had is the linear journey from acquiring the data to activating the data and figuring out what the value exchange is from people who raise their hand and say, I love Oreo, I love Sour Patch Kids, I love Cadbury chocolate. For us, we spent years trying to figure out the so what of what do you deliver to people once they raise their hand and say, I'm interested in the brand. It's taken about 2 years and millions of dollars and tons of partners. We have a global tech stack that we manage with Google. And we've spent years doing the behind the scenes, again, non-sexy part of building what we call a consumer data platform internally that is completely privacy compliant. And for us, it breaks down into, recently we spent about the last year trying to figure out what we call the North Star for consumer data, so that everybody globally, so we have 18 different BUs, we're in hundreds of countries. So for us, it's to figure out and get people understanding what is the vision of consumer data. We decided 3 years ago that consumer data would be considered an enterprise asset. So once it becomes an asset, does everybody understand why it's an asset? And then quickly we realized that we didn't have any math behind it. How do we keep score? How do we understand when the CFO says, why am I spending $10 million on infrastructure? What is the value of data to the brand and to consumers and to the enterprise? So we put together a very complex, with our partners at Accenture, a very complex monetization model that looks at everything from the marketing side of it and the consumer experience side of it, all the way to the finance component of how does first-party data benefit Mondelēz as a business. And then we had to figure out next, like I said, what is the value exchange and what is the website strategy? And then ultimately, which has been super hard, is what is the org model? So we realized very quickly we're an agency-first brand. We don't do anything in-house. And what we realized very quickly is that when the CX team where I worked used to hire people, we would just hire guys like me, people that worked at the agency and knew a little about programmatic or data or analytics. And now we've realized that we need more people that understand the consumer value exchange of content. Because like I said, it's not very difficult for us to get people to engage with the brand. But once they do, what do we send them? Why are we sending it to them? What do they expect? So we spend a ton of time trying to figure out sort of that east-west process of what do we do with data once we have it, and how do we measure it, acquire it, activate it, and monetize it.
Yeah, that's great. And I think there's two things I'd love to hear more about there. I think the org structure is a huge one. I think a lot of companies are not sure if they should be fully in, fully out. Mondelēz has, made a decision to go fully in on data. Can you talk a little bit about, kind of probably we're talking about bumpy road of challenges here, the challenges associated with, maybe building out only a very small team to support this kind of effort, and how that's probably not going to get you there?
Well, it definitely doesn't get you there. And the original team was me, and nobody else. And not just because we're agency first, just because my boss is very linear in his thinking about the relation between creative, media, and data. And we had done a very good job of, going through agency reviews and monetizing and optimizing creative and then media. And then we realized that we didn't have a data capability. We didn't have the right people in the building. For the short-term staffing was, Michael's by himself, we should hire some people to help him. And now it's become, through the global talent organization at a giant place like Mondelēz that has 80,000 people, we now are looking at what type of person do we need to hire? Because it's not the same person like when we hired me 3 years ago, just, guys that used to work at the agency. We have to find people that come from places like Accenture Song or Ogilvy or 360i, or people that really understand, once the tech is in place, how to create content that has value. Because we have all the tech with our partners at Google and the Trade Desk and, all the people that we work with. Ultimately, the talent problem is really hard for us because it requires a completely different mindset, because we're not buying media, we're not doing digital analytics, it's not a DSP, it's not a DMP, it's a very, very complex IT first organization. So fortunately for us, about a year ago, the CTO, way above my pay grade, decided that we were going to bring in 3 very, very senior IT people from P&G. And they made the decision that we were going to move away from having our data housed with agencies or inside of other places into a completely Mondelēz wholly owned privacy-first product. And that took probably a year. And getting, CPGs move very slowly, most of and we're an ROI-first organization, so it's very challenging for us to explain to people why they have to wait 2 years to see anything happen. But that's the hardest part of all this, is you have to have champions internally in the C-suite that are willing to pay for this and understand that not only does it help the business, but there's also a component of that this is just the right thing to do, and to own your own data and activate your own data and use that to drive insights and drive more efficiency and drive more effectiveness and website strategy. It's all connected. So what we're trying to do is figure out how these north-south tasks become more east to west. And, you asked me about hiring. Now, not just in my group, we now look at it as the enterprise has an add to staff opportunity. And where should that next person go? Maybe it doesn't belong in the media team. Maybe it belongs in the tech team. And when you have, the Oreo US team is not the same as the Oreo UK team. Even though it's the same brand, for a global brand, the needs are completely different. So we've completely rebuilt the organization to finally make people understand that consumer data is a monetizable, important asset.
I love that. I think it's great. I've been in data for long enough where I've seen, people go from spending to not care to caring too much. And I think it's really great to see orgs such as Mondelēz kind of really lean into this and kind of put it forth. On that last topic, you touched on one of the key words that we've all been hearing about for many years now, and that's privacy. It'd be great to hear a little bit about how Mondelēz is balancing kind of collecting consumer data with consumer privacy, and how the approach that you've taken, you touched on the fact that this is a privacy-centric way of operating, and that's why we're doing it. But how are you making those customers feel comfortable that their data is protected when we're seeing so many changes in the marketplace? And have we seen a shift in consumer behavior around data in your new approach?
Well, it's interesting. There's the hard part of this, which is the hardcore IT, how you ensure that the data is private. So if you believe or you assume that that's actually happening, through double opt-ins and blind opt-outs. But listen, we've failed at this numerous times because we have very, very complex businesses and very, very complex brands. So you can imagine, some people may opt out of communications with Mondelēz completely, not just for Oreo. And we've had challenges in how to manage, cross-brand opt-outs globally, which is very different than opting out of a Oreo promotion to, win a car. But for us, privacy, assuming that the privacy component happens from a technology point of view, for us, it's about the value exchange and the trust that, the old saying in advertising is, you don't send a vegetarian an ad for a steak. People are raising their hand and they're saying that I'm interested in Sour Patch Kids. To us, the privacy component quickly becomes, I told you something about myself, don't fuck it up. Like, I asked you about recipes for Oreo. Why are you sending me something about Sour Patch Kids? If it makes sense to the consumer, then we see that as almost as important as getting their permission to do it. And it's really hard because when you have global brands like we do, there's not a universal, much as you hear it, there's not a universal real-time opt-out across brands globally to prevent Michael Lampert from getting any communications. It's hard. So even if 1% slips through the cracks, for us, could be millions of people. So it's really, really hard. But we do the best we can. We spend millions of dollars and have probably 25 people across our internal IT team, our legal team, our compliance team. The creative agencies have specific governance rules. Their bonuses are based on, partially on compliance. All sites have to be updated in a fully global privacy compliant way with all the different regulations from CCPA to GDPR to all of it. So we invest millions of dollars in hard costs and then a lot of people time to make sure that the process works.
Great. So now that we've talked about kind of the technical pieces, the more fun side of things, now that we've had the consumers opt in, which is the most important piece, I think, from where we're going as an ad ecosystem, once you have that data, what are some of the things you're using it for as far as personalizing ad experiences and making that value prop work really well for those consumers?
Well, it's as personalized as it can be. I'm not going to tell you that every single person gets their own. So what we did when we started this process, like I said with Accenture last year, to help us understand this from a business point of view, is we figured out everything has to be problem statement use case. So for us, everything has to be rooted in a use case. So what we tried to figure out is what are the 5 or 10 most common use cases that are brand agnostic, and then how to get them to be brand specific. So for the first year, we did things like recipes, lookalike modeling, efficiency, effectiveness, tell a friend. Not super sexy, but it wasn't, we had to do foundational things first. And then, those 5 use cases are what are most common to most brands from a creative and messaging point of view, and from a content and value exchange point of view. And then, it's sort of like, a steep mountain. So the first section has 5 use cases. The second component, I think it's called like Strengthen, has a fancy name. That has about 15 use cases. And then it goes all the way 2 years from now into 2 or 3 years from now into more real-time AI, individual, AI generated creative that are much more targeted at individuals. But that's 3 years out for us, because we're not, and we started this 3 years ago. So we have an organizational principle at Mondelēz called Vision 2030. And it's literally a year-by-year, 7-year plan of which data is now foundational to all those components. So we try to go from very simple use cases into very complex use cases over time that are customized for the brand and the country.
And as we climb that mountain, how has consumer engagement changed? Are we seeing that these more personalized ad experiences where consumers are actually opting in and offering up their data are performing better than, the old way of where we were just collecting their data from all over the internet without their consent?
I'm sure the agency, some of the agency partners are here. This is not it doesn't always work like you think it should.
Right.
Because I grew up in direct response media. So for me, reaching the people frequently costs more, a lot more, even if you buy it through, programmatic platforms. So for me, if your cost is 5 times as high, it's never going to generate 5 times as much. So you have to figure out what are the KPIs, knowing that the media math may not always be on your side. Because it definitely costs more to reach people with their data than it does with just broad $2 or $3 or $5 CPM media. We could potentially have to pay $25, $30 CPMs to reach people that have opted in. So the math is a little bit challenged. So what we do is we try and set up, complex learning agendas up front that say there are hard KPIs against this as well as soft KPIs. So for some campaigns, for super power brands like Oreo or Sour Patch Kids, the math does work out, and it works out very quickly. For the smaller regional brands, they may not ever be able to do this because they don't capture enough data, and it's too hard to find the people, and it's too expensive to reach them. So what we do is we come up with a complex model inside of the model that also says, there's a soft metric of if a brand has 1 million first-party data record, 1 million zero-party data records, we can forecast over the next 3 years that they will go from 1 million to 5 million. And that has both hard value and soft value, because now your percent of known impressions increases and the unknown impressions decrease. You're gathering data in a privacy compliant way. That's a good thing. You have more records than you had when you started. That's a good thing. You can communicate with them in a more targeted way. That's a good thing. So to us and to me, that's equally as important as the performance, because 3 years from now or whenever the cookie goes away, you're not going to have a choice anyway. We tried to prepare for this 3 years ago so that if it happened tomorrow or a year from now, we don't care. The math is going to go where the math goes, and we spend billions of dollars a year on media, and we think that we have a model that allows us to know what zero and first and second party data will deliver to the enterprise over the next 7 years. So we manage as a global portfolio, and we don't really risk much where the dollars are going, because for us, everything is an ROI calculation, which is pretty different from other CPGs.
Yeah, and I think that's great. I have the same conversation quite frequently with clients that it shouldn't really matter what it costs at this point, even though sometimes it may be more efficient, because the reality is whether Google decides to deprecate cookies or not in 2024, we are in a place where on the open web, there's only about 35% of inventory with a cookie attached anyway. So kind of what you're doing is you're well ahead of a lot of folks, and I think it's been really fantastic.
Well, I mean, who cares is the media agencies. And I used to run the media agency, so it was very challenging because they don't want to hear that things are going to cost 5, 6, 10 times as much. My friend in the front row from the trade desk, we have a lot of conversations internally that we need to follow consumption, for example. And consumption is now dictating that we reallocate our dollars away from linear television and into CTV. CTV is a very expensive platform, but it's where consumers are going. So we will figure out the math behind it later. We need to take a position and be where consumption is, and we'll figure out what the math is eventually. But what we're not going to do is say it costs 5 times as much, so we're just going to, sit on it and wait for the market to drive down costs for the next 5 years. We're going to try and drive down the cost to a reasonable place and figure out how $5 media and $40 media work together and look at where that next dollar and where that next impression should go. And if you manage it at the portfolio level and your targeting is better and your creative is better and you have media plus data plus creative, you end up in a much better place, we think.
Yeah, I agree. I know we're coming up on time. We want to make sure to take any questions anyone may have. Audience.
In the back.
Hi, I'm Lisa McCauley from Johnson & Johnson Kenview.
Hi.
Hi. So, Michael, nice to meet you. I have a similar role within our group, leading data-driven marketing. One of the challenges that we're having ex-US is around measurement and how we're quantifying the impact of our known data to how it's driving performance and sales. Can you speak about your journey around within the US, we're pretty lucky with regard to how much measurement we have. Outside, it's been a harder story. So do you use analogs to be able to prove it out, or are there other ways that you've been able to do that? Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you. I mean, it's really hard. And from an old agency guy like me, I always care about the math and I always care about analytics. And, globally, it's very challenging because for a brand like Cadbury in the UK, it kind of always works, right? You do something for Easter around Cadbury Easter eggs and you gather a ton of data and it all pays out. And it's a tough question to answer because, like I just said, you have to be willing to have it go bad for a while. And you have to get people to understand that the math is going to be against you at the beginning and that there is value, like I said, in doing the right thing, serving up more privacy compliant, known impressions, realizing that you're now going to have the ability to communicate with someone like Michael, who says he likes Sour Patch Kids in any country, and that has value, and that value also has more value in terms of insights. It helps with creative design. It helps with creative execution. It helps with what type of technology you need. And I think ultimately for us, it will always come down to ROI. But what we're trying to do is put our thumb on the scale in as many places as we can to make the math work. Because in certain markets, the US is a bad example, we can't buy media any more efficiently than we are. We've already reached the floor of cost. So the only other level to pull is effectiveness. And effectiveness comes from creative and audiences. So you have to now make that part of measurement, which is that as you go up the known impression scale, everything gets better. What was it? All boats rise tides. So we're trying to do that, and we just want to make sure that analytics and data get an equal seat at the planning table. So that just like creative or media or comms planning, that everybody knows that not all campaigns have to capture first-party data, but you should have the conversation when you build a site, when you build creative, about do we have a mechanism to capture data? And if we do, what are we going to do with it? And how are we going to count it? So to make it I grew up at Digitas, so every campaign we have has to be rooted in a mathematical learning agenda, just as important as a flowchart. So I think if you just get analytics the equal seat at the table, eventually the math will work. But it's hard.
Five things that were on the basic part of that steep journey. What were those 5 again? Because
I don't remember all 5, but I know that one.
You can elaborate as much as possible that you won't, give you any secrets away. Would love to know what those 5 things are.
Well, I can tell you the easiest ones are things like, we're very fortunate because when your products are in 80% of houses every day, You don't have to chase people to buy Oreos. They buy them every week. So things like recipes. It sounds silly, but people love to cook with Oreo cookies and Ritz crackers. So how do you, that's a use case, is that if you give us your information, we will deliver you recipes information. It's not super sexy, but it's hard. And then the question becomes, so we do things, if you're asking, like recipes are an important one, lookalike models still are important things, not old school lookalikes, but so it's recipes, lookalike models, efficiency and effectiveness, and I forget what the other two are, they're not secret, but it's really the lowest hanging fruit, which is delivering why people buy the products that they do. And then the more complex use cases come, well, if somebody's interested in recipes for Oreo, maybe they're also interested in recipes for Ritz. We do have some challenges though, because if any of you have spent any time and seen the product called Oreo ID, which is a way to personalize Oreo crackers, if your children go to a college, you can get the logo printed on there. It's a really challenging thing because people call up and they go online and they spend $50 for 5 Boston Red Sox cookies, or 12 cookies. They may not be necessarily interested in the brand. They just gave Oreo as a gift. So how does that help the brand when they might hate Oreos, but they bought it as a gift? So now they've raised their hands and they said, I like Oreos at least to a certain degree. So how do we take the D2C audiences that we have for brands like Sour Patch Kids or Oreo? So that's a fourth. I don't remember what the fifth is, but it's really just using the data that we have, that we've already captured. Promotional data, sweepstakes data, brand specific data, and then just activating it.
Hey, Duncan from Been There, Done That. This is an amazing conversation, and as an ex-agency guy who went into consulting at the Accentures and IBMs, I really agree with kind of the people that you're hiring and putting around you. You don't see that enough. Without sounding like a Luddite, how do you think about brand building? How do you think about making people fall in love? How do you think about bringing new customers into your brand without that bottom funnel data, dynamic content? Like, all that stuff is amazing. But I probably grew up in the same time as you when our job was to make people fall in love with brands. And some of that was mass. Some of that was, and we don't have those water cooler moments anymore in media, or we have less of them. But how do you think about that in the big kind of, we've spoken a lot about the people, the data, the dynamic messaging, the right person, I love the brand, what do you do with it? Totally get it, but like, do you feel there's a role for making people fall in love with your brands, the next generation, the brand work? Do you know what I mean?
I mean, it's a great question, and we're super fortunate because of what the brands are. But what I will tell you is that we still do, and I don't do the media stuff as much as I used to anymore, but we still are an awareness-based first organization in brands. We still buy a ton of television. We just don't buy television the same way. For us, it goes back to when I was a media planner. We buy video now. We don't see the difference between linear television or Netflix. To us, it's just premium video. And we still do allocate from the top down. We still do have reach goals. We still do have brands that will never care about what I do because they care more about brand love. The Oreo team, for example, is very hard to bring along because what I do doesn't really impact a $4 billion brand, but it's also the right thing to do and it's the smart thing to do. So we're going to continue to buy Super Bowl ads, and we're going to continue to do programmatic retargeting. And I think that there's a way to balance creative media and data so that you never lose what is cool about Oreo, which we would never want to do. It's the most important brand in the portfolio, and we will always let the creative agencies do what they want that's best for the brand. We just want, like I said, an equal seat at the table for kind of the dorky stuff that I do. So I hope that helps.
Hey there, Marissa, Essence MediaCom. Nice to see you again, Michael. I recognize you from the hallways. You spoke a little bit about how you don't have a problem capturing data, specifically zero-party data and first-party data. That is a wonderful position to be in, particularly as a CPG brand, where I assume not all of your businesses have DTC presence. So if you could elaborate a little bit more about how you have arranged things so that you're in a great position to capture that data that consumers are not willing to part with.
You're right. I mean, I probably exaggerate a little bit that we have so much, but what we're fortunate is that we believe that the websites are the front end for us. So if we reverse engineer it all and we know that we're going to eventually drive Michael to a place where he's going to be asked to provide his data, that before I get there, our expectation is that they will be so happy to give it to us that they will. Now, not all sites are built to capture data and not all sites will be, but to us, the sites are the front end to the value exchange. And when I say we have tons of data, it's tens of millions of records. We should probably have 100 million. So the journey is how do you go from, and it gets back into old school things around, how do you convert more traffic? How do you make the value exchange do more so that the giving of your data just becomes sort of the same thing as, tapping your ATM card to pay for something. So over time, we believe that, again, the value of data plus media plus creative will make it seamless enough so that when people engage with a website or a tweet or organic social or paid social, that across all touch points is an opportunity for data capture. And if we do it right, it will just multiply as, sort of like wildfire on itself. So again, the website is the front end, but the back end is the targeting and the conversion, and ultimately the value exchange from somebody giving us their data. So it's hard and it takes a long time, but we're doing a pretty good job, I think.
All right, I think that's it for us and our our data conversation. Thanks for kind of tuning in and listening to us talk about data.